Potatoes have a reputation for being very strong and vigorous plants. They're often described as a useful crop to grow if you want to start a new garden or to clear up rough and weedy ground. I think a lot of this is simply due to the way that we tend to grow them with all the work we do in planting, earthing up, and harvesting. But potato plants are also very fast growing, producing lots of dense foliage that quickly shades out most competition. This is mainly due to the huge store of energy in the seed potato, which gives the young plants a substantial advantage. But this isn't always the case, as I found out with a crop of early potatoes that I planted in the black plot this year. Part of the crop was distinctly stunted as it grew, but only in a very defined section of one of the 4 long rows that I planted. It would seem that competition from an adjacent crop of kale was the cause. Of course, I could be mistaking correlation for causation, but the correlation was just too clear to dismiss. I am surprised that the kale plants would have had an impact because there was 1.2 meters between the rows. There didn't appear to be any competition for light or space, above ground at least, so it must have been competition within the root zone underground. To better understand what may have happened, I looked back over my records to see how these 2 plants may have interacted. I grew this particular variety of kale for the masses of tender shoots that it produces in the spring, and I didn't harvest any leaves in the autumn or overwinter. So by mid-February, the big plants were starting to grow vigorously again, and by mid-March I started to harvest the tender new shoots. A few weeks later, at the end of March, I dug over the adjacent bed for the potatoes. This digging would have cut back any roots of the kale plants that had grown that far out. It is amazing how far the roots of strong plants like kale can grow. The seed potatoes were planted in a trench along with lots of compost. And with this much fertility available to the young plants, I don't imagine there would have been much competition for nutrients, at least for the early stages of growth. But a period of unusually dry weather started at the beginning of April and lasted well into May. During a typical spring, we would expect an average of 15 millimeters of rain each week, but this year we hardly got any for more than 5 weeks. By mid-April, when the young potato plants were starting to appear above the soil, it's possible that the roots of the kale plants had grown back to recolonize at least part of the soil around the potatoes. The strong growth of the kale plants would have pulled a lot of water out of the soil as they continued to produce lots of shoots. The harvesting of the kale trailed off during the first half of May, and I should have pulled out the plants at that point or earlier. But instead I left the plants to flower for the bees, and I finally pulled them up at the end of May. By the time the kale plants were removed, the adjacent potato plants were obviously smaller than the rest of the crop, and they remained considerably smaller for the rest of the season. Unfortunately, blight hit in the first week of July, much earlier than in previous years, prematurely ending any further growth and a chance for these plants to catch up. In the end, it seems that competition for soil moisture during that 5-week dry period was the key issue. The potato plants likely had to compete for limited soil moisture with the roots of a larger and more aggressive neighbor occupying the same soil. They would likely have struggled to get sufficient supplies of water just when they were becoming established. I had expected a slightly lower yield because of this, but I was surprised when I dug them up that the stunted potato plants had produced 60% less than the other plants. I also found it intriguing that many of the potatoes from the stunted plants were approximately the same size as the rest. There were just fewer of them. I had expected there to be roughly the same number of tubers per plant, just a lot smaller. But about 60% of the potatoes were simply missing, rather than the average potato size being 60% smaller. At some point early on in their development, it seems that the potato plants that didn't have enough water were triggered somehow into producing fewer tubers. Perhaps, given the conditions at the time, they opted for producing flowers and seeds instead. Potato plants have 2 natural methods of reproducing, and seed production may be a safer option in stressed conditions. I wish I'd been more observant of what was going on at the time, because that would be really interesting if that was what happened. A small amount of watering at the right time may have been enough to convince these young plants that producing lots of tubers was the way to go, possibly preventing the loss of so much of the crop. I suspect that the few weeks between the middle and end of April, after the young plants had started to appear above the soil, was a critical time to make sure that they had enough water. Of course, removing the kale plants earlier in May could have helped as well, but I wonder if the damage had already been set. I'm seeing lots of examples of too much competition, especially in my polycrop garden, as well as elsewhere where I'm trying to grow young plants beside larger or more established plants. I'm learning more and more how important it is to plan carefully to avoid detrimental interactions between all of the different plants that I'm growing, especially in a smaller garden. I'm also trying to be more observant, to intervene at an appropriate time where possible and in a useful way. But at least now I understand that even in rainy Ireland, it's possible for potato yields to be drastically reduced because of a lack of water. Subscribers to this channel may have noticed that this is the first video I've uploaded in a while. It's been a busy season, but the gardens have developed really well, and I've got lots of interesting content for videos that I'm planning to make in the coming weeks and months. If you'd like to support me in making more videos and to continue the development of these gardens, please consider becoming a patron on my Patreon page. Contributions by people like you will help me to continue with this project and ensure that I can take the time to produce more videos in the future. But for now, thanks for watching.